Greetings, students! Let me begin by saying hello. I am Professor Bulwer Smythe, and this is The Prism. It is my little corner of this YouTube channel that is populated by other members of my university, who I believe that you have met in recent weeks. Scorched Sands University, that is. If you like this sort of thing, please do like and subscribe, hit the alarm bell for notifications, and so on. I do have a Coffee link below, which you can visit and do a little purchasing, perhaps some merchandise, or leave a donation. If you would like to see more of these types of videos, this is the way to make your voice heard in that regard. Comments are also always appreciated, of course. This all takes an enormous amount of time to research and produce, and we can only continue to do so if we all pitch in a little bit. So, thank you. Now, on to the lecture. I'd like to pick up a thread that we left dangling some many months ago. The thread concerns the hobo, a figure from whom many threads and tatters tend to dangle. I encourage you to go back and watch this series from its beginning, but to briefly recap our findings so far. The hobo is a class of American wanderer that flourished in 3 well-documented phases, each separated by a gap of about 55 years, beginning in the mid-late 19th century. That is, the late-mid-19th century, for those who are counting. However, that supposedly first period already referred to certain mysterious entities known as the old-timers, who existed prior to the historical record. I posit that these are not merely old-timers in the colloquial use of the term, because such would require an established hobo culture prior to its recorded establishment, and the inquiry into these old-timers has been the long-term aim of our series. Furthermore, we described how the binding agent of hobo culture, the practice of riding in uninsulated train cars, is a phenomenon documented to produce trance states, and that trance states are a known precursor to spirit contact. Moreover, we observed that there is only a sort of hazy distinction between the common hobo glyphs scrawled on the boxcars and certain so-called demonic sigils employed by elemental spirits in medieval grimoires. To put a fine point on it, the suggestion here is that the elemental spirits were insinuating themselves into hobo society, taking the opportunity from the minds that had been wrenched open by the train tracks trance, and taking advantage of that society's anonymity to coexist without detection. Lastly, we noted certain biblical accounts that the social intercourse between spirit and human is the foundation of magical knowledge, i.e., that the spirits teach the humans. Now, so far we have this theoretical groundwork to suppose that such an interchange might be occurring, suggested by the overlap of spirit and hobo glyphs, and by the general narrative surrounding itinerant groups discussed in our second video. But if that were the case, there would be some sort of evidence, would there not? And there are indeed certain petty instances scattered throughout the newspapers of the time. The Boston Globe in 1916 ran a report describing hobo trafficking in magic charms, claiming that a particular lodestone, that is, a magnet, that he carried kept his leg from getting broken, a common fear among train hoppers. Elsewhere, among a collection of 16 purported hobo signs, one of them is devoted to an instrument typically associated with the practice of low magic, the pendulum. Another minor incident is reported in a surprisingly uncredited article entitled Chalk Marks that appears in a collection of otherwise very thoroughly credited works. The paragraph describes the discovery of a skeleton found in a boxcar holding a piece of chalk, next to the inscription written on the walls of the boxcar reading, "If 2 trains ever passed on a single track, the secret has been hid." These here two train tried it, and it simply can't be did. Now, that is a truly remarkable couplet. To unpack the poetry, such as it is, it claims that, quote, these two trains smashed into each other on a track, and seems to offer up the skeleton of the hobo as evidence of the ensuing crash. However, there are a few odd sticking points. 1, the skeleton is intact, and so is the boxcar. 2, there are no 2 boxcars here, just the one. 3, there is an out-of-time quality here. How is this body meant to have ridden unmolested on this train for long enough to have completely defleshed after dying in this accident? What is at first taken as humor in the first line, the if-then structure of the proposition allowing for the possibility that the 2 trains might pass each other on a single track by means of some occult secret, in light of the uncanniness of a completely decomposed human body, and what we already know to be the weird power of what's inscribed with hobo chalk, begins to take on a more literal shade. My assumption is that the report is apocryphal, but that only pushes it into the realm of the symbolic and does not really make me any more at ease with it. If not the skeleton, was it a newspaper man who was suggesting some secret? And what is known by the author? What secrets kept by this skeleton? And then there is Hobo's cant, a sort of cipher language by which they communicated with each other, a dialect of underworld provenance. There is an enormous amount of interesting material to be found on the subject on the internet, and you, dear viewer, can consider it your homework to peruse these lists and leave a comment on obscure connections that you may uncover. For my part, I just want to cover a few interesting terms that jumped out at me as regarding Hobo's relationship to that grimmest of reapers' death. I found 3 terms attested in a number of places that indicate that hobos, or at least certain hobos, might have passed beyond the veil, so to speak. Stiff was a general term to refer to other hobos, with variations like bindle stiff to indicate a hobo who carried a bindle. Stiff is, of course, still having a little currency to refer to corpses on which rigor mortis has inflicted a certain unwillingness to bend. Moreover, dead one was a phrase used to describe a drunken hobo, and ghost story refers to a, quote, plausible tale told to a housewife. That is, a hard luck tale. But this formulation, again, eerily refers to the hobo speaker as a ghost. The constancy of this theme, that hobos should be casually referred to as a dead person, is enough to make one question whether there wasn't, in fact, some truth to it. In another interesting entry, cigarettes might be referred to as coffin nails. At first glance, this would appear to refer to the deadliness of cigarettes, but that fact wasn't widely known until the Surgeon General's warning issued in 1964. Where else does one hear of coffin nails, aside from its most obvious function in the craft of the most Gothic amongst the carpenters? Why, yes, here is an entry from that notorious manual of black magic, the Grimorium Verum. This is the same manual where we found a link between the Hobo Directionality Glyph and that of the demon Sustugriel. In its 2nd chapter, entitled Of Natural and Supernatural Secrets, Secret 9, The Curse of the Nails, instructs the would-be curse caster to obtain nails from an old coffin. Nor was it alone in this, but this was a common magical ingredient in books of supernatural secrets in the Middle Ages. Could it be that this renaming was an attempt to transfigure a common material, cigarettes, into an uncommon material, coffin nails, as a sort of glamour to the cigarette butt in order to make it a valid substitution to the recipes inherited from certain of the more cryptic of the old-timers? We see a similar logic at play in the 10th secret of the Grimorium Verum, in which the aspiring cursecaster is instructed to say to a waxen image that they are burning, "It is not wax that I scorch, it is the head, heart, and spleen of my victim that I scorch." If merely renaming the image is enough to enact some sort of spiritual co-identity, perhaps naming cigarettes coffin nails would indeed have made them usable as coffin nails. But is it possible there was some unintended consequences. After all, the deadliness of cigarettes followed naming them coffin nails. Could it be that over time the qualities of the nickname sank in? Perhaps. I realize that we have gone somewhat far afield of our point, but I do just want to put forward one more observation while we're here, and it concerns one of those spirit sigils listed in these 2 spells. Each of these spells is meant to be powered by 3 demons, whose aid is evoked by the drawing of their sign. One demon who appears in both is named Sergot, and this is his seal. And doesn't it bear a striking resemblance to this symbol provided by a hobo to the Great Falls Leader newspaper in Montana in 1889? Back to the dictionary for one final phrase. To quote-unquote catch the westbound means to die. The metaphor, one supposes, is astrological. The sun dies in the west each evening, hence a person catching a westbound train heads to the land of death. But does this suggest the presence of another eastbound train? And who knows the spot and the time to catch such a boxcar? But among our hobos, we have not only the fascinating jargon, but the written word as well. We covered monikers in some detail in our last installment, but we left off the famous Hobo Glyphs. My initial reason for doing this is that after my research, I concluded that those glyphs must mostly be hoaxes. Stories sold to gullible reporters by mercurial hobos eager for some remuneration. This belief was founded on a rather well-argued pamphlet published by the Historical Graffiti Society, in which they conclude that the purported hobo symbols could not constitute a language, citing several newspaper articles that gave different interpretations of the same symbols. For example, while A number 1 claims that a diamond means railroad ducat, these folks give money for fare, a paper in 1902 published a key that described the same symbol as meaning keep quiet stool pigeons. With this proliferation of meanings, could communication really be possible via these signs? An argument that at first I found convincing. Though there was a certain degree of consistency, particularly in the hash mark indicating a jail across most accounts, there was not really enough to support the theory, and there was a lack of material evidence. But then again, the supposed material evidence was chalk marks, and chalk washes away. And on revisiting that argument, I did identify one unexamined assumption, that the signs were written to communicate between hobos. Suppose instead that these signs were written according to the principles established by Austin Osman Spare as the alphabet of desire. In his use, original letters and pictograms were devised not to communicate ideas, but to concretize desires. Following certain rules, one invents new letters, which are then supposed to have the power to manifest one's will. This occult theory was developed in the early 20th century, in the heart of hoboing's first historical generation. Is the well-documented fact that these hobo glyphs fail as a communication device not in actuality a support of the notion that they have some occult, that is, hidden function? And indeed, occult power is attributed to these signs, though not in the way that one would suppose. The fictions disseminated in the newspapers suggest that they are a lexicon with distinct meanings, but this suggestion only comes in the dictionary-style entries. The only articles describing their effects describe 2 powers that these glyphs seem to have: to attract and to repel hobos. Take, for example, this story in the St. Louis Star-and-Times, in which the municipal police deploy hobo signs around the city in order to dissuade hobos from arriving in town. Or this cartoon, published in 1903 in the Standard Union. The image of a man fleeing is captioned, "One effect produced by a sign in the hobo code." On the other hand, there are several accounts of hobos having successfully dined at someone's house, leaving a mark, and then the house being flooded with other hobos. The ambivalence of hobos to these signs has something in common with the relationship between spirits and their images in ancient apotropaic magic. The Gorgonean, that is, the image of Medusa's face, is one of the oldest magical charms in existence. It is at once the presence of this demon, the Queen of Hell, but at the same time a ward against evil spirits. Similarly, the Evil Eye amulet, still popular in esoteric circles today, both is an image of the Evil Eye itself and is said to repel that particular curse. Lastly, I'll note that the famous story of Jesus' confrontation with the Sadducees, they accuse him of working for demons because he is able to banish them. This duality, to be summoned and banished by your own sign, is a function not of humanity, but of spirits. And this is not the only time that hobos are treated as spirits. The Chicago Tribune published in 1889 an article entitled A Study of Tramp Life, in which they describe the hobos as being capable of several fakes, such as the ability to make one of their arms appear bloody by, quote, application of an acid. I can imagine, I suppose, an acid turning an arm red, but making it appear bloody to a person from whom you are a mere coins-tossing distance away sounds to me like a rather sophisticated illusion. What they refer to in fairy circles as a glamour. My interest is also piqued by the way that the meeting places of hobos are described. In an Indianapolis News article published in 1910, several Hobo Haunts are described. First, an abandoned railroad building. Secondly, an area beneath an ancient water tower. Next, the so-called Hobo Hollow, which was a bend in a river near a train tracks. And finally, a place that they call Tramp's Paradise, which was a spot at the crossing of two railroads. A crossroads, if you will. Compare this to the Key of Solomon's list of places appropriate for spirit work. The borders of lakes, forests, dark and obscure places, old and deserted houses, whither rarely or scarcely ever do men come, mountains, caves, caverns, grottos, gardens, and orchards, but best of all, are crossroads, and where four roads meet. These lists not only have the exact same structure, with their climax in a crossroads, but the similarity in listing places, either natural or abandoned, is striking. I'm interested too in the attestations of an article entitled A Hobo's Camp in Eau Claire, in which a reporter asks a hobo, "Are there camps like this in every city?" "Yes," replies the hobo, "in every city of importance." "How can a man coming to town for the first time find a camp like this?" the reporter replies, to which the hobo responds slyly, "Oh, we find 'em." He is then interrupted by a fellow hobo who loudly tells the reporter that his friend is talking nonsense and not to believe him. To me, this has the ring of a hobo camp being a sort of otherworld, like the fairy courts under the hills of Ireland, which exist in a borderland between everywhere, nowhere, and a few very specific localities. And so, what I hope to have established here is that, at least as far as the popular narrative at the time was concerned, hobos were subconsciously understood as a spirit group themselves. Couple this with the conclusion of our previous video that hobos met all conditions for spirit contact, and that certain hobo signatures bear a striking resemblance to the ancient spirit signatures, and what we are left with is a compelling blur. A blur between the hobo and the spirits that rode the tracks with them. We are nearly prepared to answer the initial question that launched this series of inquiries. Who were the old-timers? In order to do this, we'll need to explain the principal material evidence that survives of the hobo of old, and we will do that next time. Thank you for joining us on this journey so far. Please do like and subscribe, and follow the Coffee link below. Your donations allow me to keep this channel running during my puppeteer's other responsibilities. And there are also for sale certain merchandise that have been lovingly crafted by my puppeteer and his spouse. Until next time, may the pyramid's eye watch over us all.